Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore the Trivium. Now, we've kind of dealt with this before. We've dealt with the 7 liberal arts. It was the first 8 episodes because I did an overview and then looked at each of the arts. Now, in our 3rd season, I want to deal with the Trivium. Why? Well, first of all, it was a presentation that was requested of me. And so I want to make sure that we're using things in the best way possible. There's also more information because since I studied the 7 liberal arts and put together those episodes, I have done a lot more study, and I took on a new job where I am going to be teaching pre-law class, pre-law studies, and focusing the entire first semester on the Trivium. And by the way, this is at high school level, not at college level, the new material, so don't worry, it's not going to go way over people's heads. But I want to start with what are the 7 liberal arts and sciences before we break down into the Trivium itself, its purpose, why it exists, and why we're asked, why Preston, in his wisdom, asked us to consider it in the degrees. So, the 7 liberal arts. The term liberal arts comes from a Latin word, liber, which means to free. Thus, it was believed that the 7 liberal arts would free one through the knowledge gained in each of the disciplines. The term 7 liberal arts, or artes liberales, refers to the specific branches of knowledge that were taught in classical and medieval schools. Classical being the Greeks and the Romans, and then into the medieval, that period right up until really through the Renaissance as we sort of look at Western history. The 7 arts are composed of 2 families consisting of 3 and respectively 4 arts. This 3 plus 4 structure is critical to understand how these arts complement each other and how we're supposed to learn them. The first family is the Trivium, and is composed of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, although classically it goes grammar, logic, rhetoric. In Masonry, we kind of reverse rhetoric and logic. Grammar defines the rules used to construct phrases, sentences, words, and connects these elements to communicate ideas. It's really an understanding of this first art that allows us to learn and to understand, to structure the information that we have. Then there's rhetoric, the art of using language as a means to persuade. Once a student learns how to read and write properly via grammar, they then are prepared to manipulate words and sentences to express complex ideas. The reason these are often reversed, logic and rhetoric, is logic is about how to think. Rhetoric is how to put your ideas together. So rhetoric requires logic. That's why we see that alteration. Dialectic or logic is reasoning, which seeks to confront and contrast ideas, identify which is correct and which is not, remove ambiguity, and measure, compare, analyze, prove, and demonstrate facts with clarity. So grammar is the mechanics of language. Rhetoric is the use of language to instruct and persuade. Logic is the mechanics of thinking clearly, of comparison and analysis. So they do build on each other no matter which order you put them in. So why this 3 plus 4 structure? Well, the first 3 arts, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, are the 3 ancient arts of discourse, also known as the Trivium. The Trivium was a fundamental path in education used to train public speakers and writers to direct audiences to action with their arguments. It really comes out of the Greeks and the Romans loving rhetoric and public speaking, the Greeks loving the idea of persuasion, especially with democracy. We see philosophers, lawyers, public servants, leaders, military officers, and teachers rely on the mastery of the Trivium to perform their duties and influence people. The knowledge of discourse and of persuasion coming originally from the schools of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates in ancient Greece. Later in medieval times, the study of logic, grammar, and rhetoric were considered a prerequisite before learning the quadrivium, the four roads which are made up of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. In other words, you need to know how to think, how to learn, how to interact with knowledge before you can really gain knowledge of the world around you. It's no different than us calling grade school grammar school in some places. The Trivium does not address specific subjects. Instead, it teaches the student how to read, how to write, debate, compare, analyze, and make conclusions. It's really about critical thinking at the end of the day, how to think. The teachings of the quadrivium, of course, assumes that the trivium has already been mastered. That way, the student can take in that knowledge, they can understand it, they can compare it, and they can share it using grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So the three arts to express, communicate, and compare, which serve as tools with the four sciences that open the universe to be measured and understood. In practice, to ignore the order would be the same as teaching advanced calculus before the student is familiar with basic arithmetic, or even knows how to read. This is the only way a student would receive formal education in the ancient, classical, and medieval world. And this system has reflections echoed in our modern systems today, our modern education system. We first learn the alphabet before we learn how to write a book. We first learn phonics and how words should sound before we're taught the art of persuasion. We take things in order, and we do it for a reason. So I want to look at the three disciplines of the Trivium here in a little bit more detail. Grammar, when we look at it, seems like the easiest of the three. It's sentences, it's punctuation, grammar, to use the word in its own definition, capitalization, it's how we lay out our writing, but it's so much more. According to Preston, grammar teaches the proper arrangement of words according to the idiom or dialect of any particular people, and enables us to speak or write a language with accuracy, agreeable to reason and correct usage. Why? If you don't have a structure to your communication, then it would make no sense. We've all read material that sounds like a word salad that's poorly put together. One idea coming before the idea that really should be after it. Arguments that are laid out poorly. So this art encompasses studying written works and the forms of writing. This way we can formally understand the structure of dialogue as well, of spoken word. This often happens through memorization and reading of classical texts, which if you went to school in the 80s and earlier, you probably are familiar with this. Or if you went to private school a little bit later, or you were stuck like me in 4 years of Latin, there's a lot of grammar there. And it may not sound like it, but I did have to deal with it a lot. Learning and diagramming the parts of speech becomes common, and other language-related knowledge like spelling and vocabulary grows out of an understanding of that grammatical structure. Grammar is nothing more than structure. Sometimes there's a misconception that a language has grammar only when written. In other words, spoken language or oral versions of them are free of grammar, and this is of course not true. We've all had conversations with people where we hear our own words as being poorly laid out, and we go back and correct them. You've probably heard me do this live on the podcast as well. It's very, very common. It's why if you want to edit a piece of your own writing, speaking it out loud will help immensely because we have heard the rules of grammar far longer than we have written them. Of course, we've heard them going back to when we were barely children, when we were 2 or 3, really starting to deal with oral language. The grammatical structures are there, and we learn them during the process that is called language acquisition. Of course, we don't just know these rules. We are not aware of the underlying grammatical rules and structures that make our speech intelligible. Rather, we learn them as children through repetition, through hearing them from other people. That's why reading books to children, speaking to children is so important, because they need to hear what is proper. That way, what is improper will sound wrong, and they'll know that there's something there that needs to be corrected. And the scientific discipline describing and organizing these rules is known as grammar. Why do we need it today? Of course, in spoken language, it's obvious from the context where pauses should be, where emphasis should be placed. In written language, there isn't, and that's where grammar really came in. It's one thing to stylize oral language, but we can hear what is wrong. Written language, well, we don't learn writing the same way we learn to speak. We don't simply mimic what we've read before. And by the time we do, we've already been studying the grammar of oral language for many years. Written language comes later. So grammar, at its heart, is the difference between knowing your, and your. Because writing is so much harder to understand than speech, we all need a certain amount of teaching in order to be able to do it well. So why the need to learn grammar? Well, grammar, even today, organizes written words into clear and intelligible sentences, paragraphs, and ideas. It allows us to communicate nuance in speech and, as a result, allows us to organize our thoughts, turning a mass of ideas into a cohesive message. Today, even with AI, Grammarly, all of these programs that will correct your grammar and spelling, I will tell you as a teacher that grammar is still incredibly important to learn, because what the computer catches is not necessarily going to capture everything. It maybe captures 30%. I have students every semester hand in word salad for essays, and I have to hand it back to them and say, what in the heck are you writing? And they need to go back and study grammar, something that is oftentimes lacking in education today. Which brings us to rhetoric. What is rhetoric? Rhetoric teaches us to speak fluently on any subject. And this is according to Preston. Not merely with propriety, but with all the advantages of force and elegance, wisely contriving to captivate the hearer by strength of argument and beauty of expression, whether it be to entreat or extort, to admonish or applaud. Rhetoric is the study and art of writing and speaking well. We tend to think of it as persuasive writing, but it isn't always. And knowing how to compose successful written and oral presentations. Rhetoric is any kind of presentation. It could be a written report, which we think of as grammar, but very much the way the argument is laid out is rhetoric. Rhetoric teaches us the essential skills of advanced learning and higher education. Through rhetoric, students learn to think logically, to discover wrong or weak arguments, to build a good case on a controversial topic, or to overcome the all too common fear of speaking in public, so that they can deliver crisp and well-prepared speeches, writings, any kind of persuasive piece. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. In other words, rhetoric is the ability to see before you a host of options for how you might influence or persuade someone, to turn them towards your argument. And there are a lot of ways to do it. Why do we need this today? Well, at a very basic level, who hasn't experienced the sensation of trying to put something into your own words or talking about something aloud that you don't quite understand? How many of you have talked to yourselves in the shower or elsewhere trying to work out an idea? That's the use of rhetoric. It's the process of speaking or writing that clarifies and crystallizes ideas that you have been seeking to grasp. Oftentimes, people will tell you, especially teachers, that when they really grasp an idea is when they teach it, not when they read about it. Because you're going to pick up connections. You're presenting it orally, having read it, having understood it. And instead of seeing it in isolation, by presenting this longer realm of material, we piece it together, in part because of rhetoric, because of hearing it orally, or orally via ear. So it's this process that can crystallize things. Its enduring presence through the ages cements its status as a crucial tool in uncovering how power is wielded through discourse. Today, rhetoric is perhaps more important than ever as discourses of power continue to evolve. We see this in politics all the time. If you understand rhetoric, you understand what the politician is trying to get you to think and why they're trying to do it. Well, logic will help with that second part. And that becomes incredibly important. We live in a world of talking points. Rhetoric helps us understand what strings they're trying to pull, what switches they're trying to flick in our brains to change how we think. It helps us understand everything from the current events to how advertisers try to make us buy things. So taking it beyond the political sphere, we see its capabilities and impact in everyday life. Far from being a tool used only by the powerful to manipulate the powerless, rhetoric is in fact a medium that can be used by anyone. From elementary school children trying to beg their parents to take them to Disney, to doctors who need to find a good way of explaining a condition to a patient, to parents trying to talk to people of different educational levels, i.e. children, CEOs, teachers, and of course writers. Most people today have not been trained in the art of dialectic and therefore may not listen to an airtight logical argument. We'll get to dialectic later. Regardless of its truthfulness, we don't like logical arguments as humans. We like emotional arguments. That's why during the State of the Union, whoever's talking is going to have several people stand up and tell their personal story, apparently forgetting that the plural of anecdote is not data, to quote one Cameron Schulte of Waukesha Lodge, who famously used that quote. Most people today need this. They need to see how they're being influenced, especially in a day and age where influence is all around us. There's an art of the trivium our culture needs, and it is the art of rhetoric. And when we have this rhetoric out there that we know is being used poorly to manipulate people, to control people, we equally need those who can look at it, analyze it, and point it out to others. We need people who can honestly tell us when we're being manipulated, when we're being controlled. There must be good rhetoric out there, if only to combat all the bad and evil rhetoric reverberating constantly in our ears. And the rhetorical tradition tends to agree. Just as there is no true eloquence without wisdom, the true orator, the genuine leader, must be a good person. Finally, logic. Logic teaches us to guide our reason. Again, according to Preston. Logic teaches us to guide our reason discreetly in the general knowledge of things and direct our inquiries after truth. It consists of a regular train of argument, whence we infer, deduce, and conclude, according to certain premises laid down, admitted, or granted, and in it are employed the faculties of conceiving, judging, reasoning, and disposing, which are naturally led on from one gradation to another, till the point in question is finally determined. So logic is basically critical thinking. It helps us determine good information from opinion that's being presented as logic, which we've all come across. In fact, in the political season, this being recorded in fall of 24, we are surrounded by these issues. Logic is the way we articulate relationships between prepositions which lead to the acceptance of one based on another accepted preposition or prepositions. For example, you might say there's as a premise, all spiders have 8 legs. Black widows are a type of spider. Therefore, your conclusion would be black widows have 8 legs. This is a very basic syllogism. This is a very basic logical argument. A equals B, therefore B equals C. Now, this is not always the case. I could say bananas are yellow, cars are yellow, therefore cars are bananas. Well, this is not a true syllogism, but that's where logic comes in. It allows us to look at it and go, hey, there's a problem here. The aim of logic is to secure clearness, consistency, and validity of reason. It's thinking about how we think. We use logic every day, whether we realize it or not. If you've ever troubleshot an engine or a computer, If you have a dough that won't rise or similar issue, you're using logic to work through those steps. Logic is important to Masons because it furthers the pursuit of one of our most important principles, truth, and contributes to removing flaws in one's own character. The use of logic allows us to question our own thoughts, our own ideas, and change them as necessary. There should be no thought that any man has that there isn't enough evidence to change. True mastery of logic means freedom from anger, envy, and jealousy because you don't need it. You're not going to be angry at someone when you recognize that their logic, their ideas, don't match yours. It's not necessarily a reflection on you. Of course, this is easier said than done. Logic is ultimately a framework. But we also have something called dialectic that plays in. Masonically, we're taught about logic, but logic is only half of a necessary pair. When you look at the 7 liberal arts in the classical world and the medieval world, oftentimes they talk about logic and dialectic as the same thing. So traditionally, the 7 liberal arts use both terms. Dialectic thinking refers to the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives and to arrive at the most economical and reasonable reconciliation of these ideas. In other words, it's listening to your opponent, understanding their perspective, and in fact, arguably making sure you focus on their perspective more than you focus on your own argument. You already know your own argument. And it allows you to find compromise, to find truth between those two ends of a spectrum. For example, engaging someone in debate on an issue would be a dialectical approach. Then say the opposed debater presented an argument that had a logical fallacy. There are, of course, dozens of them, and we've talked about them in other episodes. In this case, you could point out the failure of logic as part of pursuing the dialectic of eliciting truth. You could also ignore it and see it as a weakness, or recognize that just because there is a logical fallacy doesn't mean that the premise itself is false. Dialectic is how you find understanding, argue, and synthesize logic. It's taking in someone else's ideas and changing your own based on their concepts. Masonically, this is the attentive ear. This is incredibly important. So what is dialectic? According to Plato, dialectic is the process by which people achieve knowledge. Aristotle famously adds that dialectic is simply argument proceeding from an agreed premise. In other words, you have to agree on something. There has to be a foundation before you can have dialectic conversation. Dialectic is the dawn of thinking, the daring to ask why, and the endeavor to weigh the multitude of ideas conceived throughout history in order to determine what aligns with the way things actually are, or as close as we can get to it. Francis Bacon, pioneer of the scientific method, called dialectic the art of judgment. John Locke, the great English philosopher, similarly calls dialectic an essential skill of the educated person and of the sincere lover of truth. None of us are going to come by the truth in isolation. We have to take in ideas from other people. Dialectic is how we do it. So why do we need logic today? Of course, logic brings order. It builds mental habits of thinking in an orderly way. No course is more practical than logic, for no matter what you are thinking about, you are thinking, and the logic, or logic in general, orders and clarifies your thinking. No matter what your thought's contents, it will be clearer when it has a logical form. It also brings power, the power of proof and persuasion. The power of logic comes from the fact that it is scientific, it is the art of argument. Any power can be either rightly used or abused, and logic allows us to determine which side of that spectrum we're on. Logic helps us communicate clearly and effectively. We can use it to create clear writing and clear thinking. Really, it's a package deal. The presence or absence of either brings the presence or absence of the other. Common sense expects it, and scientific studies confirm it. Writing skills have declined dramatically over the past 40, 50 years, since logic has changed. We've replaced symbolic logic, sort of the logic you would learn in long-form math, with Aristotelian logic. And this is probably not a coincidence. It's simply impossible to communicate clearly and effectively without thinking clearly and effectively. Logic also helps us attain wisdom, for logic is one of philosophy's main instruments. It allows us to question our own ideas, be open to taking in other ideas, and thus grow, that growth being known as wisdom. Logic helps in testing authority. Of course, we need to test authority every so often. We need authorities. This is not saying we don't need them, because no individual knows everything autonomously. We do in fact rely on the human community and therefore on the authority of others, parents, teachers, textbooks, experts, etc., for a surprising amount of what we know and how we argue. And so we need to be willing to question their arguments and do so properly. This isn't simply going, well, I don't understand it and therefore I disagree with it. This is saying, I don't understand it, so I'm going to go out and study it as much as I reasonably can. I'm going to look at a number of different experts, and I'm going to try and develop an understanding of the consensus of that area. And logic never becomes obsolete. The principles of logic are timeless and true. It helps one attain truth or knowledge. It helps us find truth, and the truth is its own end. Truth being one of those major elements of Masonry. It's worth knowing for its own sake. To be honest, there should be few, if any, issues that exist in the minds of men that an abundance of evidence cannot alter. That's logic. Just because you believe something doesn't make it true. And logic states that there should be out there, for any belief that you have, some form of evidence that could exist, doesn't have to, but could exist, that would change your mind. If you believe wholeheartedly in a mythical being, there should also be some evidence out there that would change your mind. Maybe that mythical being doesn't exist, but another one does. Or maybe that one doesn't exist. Children do this all the time. How many children have tested the tooth fairy by hiding a tooth from their parent, not telling them that it fell out, and then coming to them 3 days later going, well, I guess the tooth fairy doesn't exist. My molar is still here, and there's no money. Thus starts capitalism, but that's a whole different issue. In conclusion, if we are to become better men, we must work at being better able to understand our world. The Trivium lays a foundation on which we can build our knowledge of any subject, from history to calculus. These three liberal arts are presented for a purpose. They charge us to continue to be learners. Education did not stop with graduation. We must work to improve ourselves throughout a greater understanding of the world around us. By developing our understanding, we improve as men and smooth the edges of our rough ashlar by using the attentive ear to learn from the instructive tongues of so many previous generations. And if you want to look further into the Trivium, there's a great book called The Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric by Sister Miriam Joseph. It was printed in about 1982, and it is a very approachable text. You can still get it today on Amazon, etc. And it goes through the function of the Trivium and how it can change the way you think. Quite literally, you can look at it as grammar, and the use of grammar changes how we construct our thoughts, and the form of persuasion, grammar thus affecting how we think or what we think. That's why certain arguments work and certain arguments don't. But it's definitely something I would recommend that you look into at some point in the future. After all, we're here trying to take good men and make them better. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Leakey, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.